Good morning, everybody. I think we're going to start, despite the early start and disruption some people had in the middle of the night, apparently. So anyway, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here, and especially to welcome our speaker today in our final keynote speech of the conference. So Professor Jimi Adeṣina is professor. He's the South African Research Chair in Social Policy at the College of Graduate Studies at UNISA, University of South Africa. Jimi was educated in Ibadan, Nigeria, and also at Warwick here in the UK. And he's taught at Ibadan at the university there, and where he was chair of the Department of Sociology. And then he moved on to Rhodes University in South Africa, where he was professor of sociology and then professor of sociology again and head of department at the University of the Western Cape. He's had a range of visiting appointments internationally, including at University of Ulster in Derry, Northern Ireland, at the University of Witwatersrand, Wits in South Africa again, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in Addis, the University of Oxford, the Nordic Africa Institute, and UNRIS, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, which creates a nice strong thread also with the life and work of Thandika Mkandawire. We've worked together, Jimi and I, on a Thandika Mkandawire Prize in recent years. Professor Adeṣina's research interests include broadly sociology, social policy, and the political economy of development in Africa. And he's published extensively in those areas. And this morning, he's going to talk to us about rereading the right to development, the imperative of a sovereign national project and of policy sovereignty. And he's going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then I will pop up again and manage some Q&A. So, Professor Adeṣina, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And it's a pleasure, meeting you again, except that this time it's in person rather than the virtual meeting we'll be having over the Mkandawire Prize. Let me start off by, again, thanking Mike Jennings for the honor of the invitation. It's a considerable privilege for me. And to thank the leadership of the Development Studies Association. I must confess, this is my first time attending the DSA conference. And to thank Winnie and Alex, who held forth in the background. As you will notice, the focus of my talk this morning is a bit different from what was originally advertised. I mean, the linchpin between that in the original something was the idea of right to development. And I thought it was important perhaps to flesh it out a bit more, and then pivoted to making this the primary focus of my presentation. Let me start off by saying that the discourse on the right to development has multiple origins. The first involves the demand for the right of nation state to development. The second, which is the final, shifts the focus of the right to individuals. A shift sometimes inferred as the human rights approach to development and associated in its dominant form with the UN Commission on Human Rights. If the dawn of political independence in the former colonies carried with it much optimism, by the early 1960s, as Looney will argue, many developing countries were frustrated by their growth prospects and started demanding a better deal. Kwame Nkrumah's neocolonialism is perhaps one of the most eloquent analyses of the burden of what we call flag independence without economic autonomy. For those who practice it, neocolonialism, Nkrumah argued, means power without responsibility. And for those who suffer from it, it means exploitation without redress. The newly emerging countries within the framework of the non-aligned movement took up the campaign, first outlined in the 1955 Bandung Conference within the UN. They took the campaign within the UN system. The demand for redress in international political economy and sovereignty in their development led to the establishment of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, by the UN General Assembly in 1964, with a focus on fairer terms of trade and more liberal terms for financing development. At the October 1967 first ministerial meeting of the Group of 77 developing countries in Algiers, and Algiers will recall repeatedly in these demands. Countries in the global south, I know it's a controversial something, but I'll use it as a brief handle for developing countries, set out in great details the structural dimensions of the prevailing international economic order that hindered their development. The Charter of Algiers, which is what was issued by the G77, that emerged from the meeting, argued that while the primary responsibility for their development rests on the developing countries, I quote, "The international community has an obligation to rectify these unfavorable trends and to create conditions under which all nations can enjoy economic and social well-being and have means to develop their respective resources to enable their people to lead a life free from want and fear," end of quote. Deteriorating terms of trade against developing countries, increasing onerous terms of and conditions for development finance, declining share of grants in development financing, rising interest rates, shorter repayment period, and increasingly tight aid were some of the crippling conditions imposed by developed countries that undermine developing countries' efforts to transcend their underdevelopment. The call for a new system of international economic relations was matched in the Charter of Algiers by a detailed plan of action by G77 member states. By the early 1970s, the perception of the configuration of international economic system as a hindrance to the development prospect of the new states had become gloomier. This coalesced in a more straightforward political desire to participate more effectively in decision-making in international economic matters, not merely to ensure that the developing countries' interests are safeguarded, but equally as an assertion of their rights as members of the international community and as a desired feature of a just international order. This demand for a new international economic order was taken up within the United Nations. 3 major resolutions were adopted by the UN General Assembly between 1st May 1974 and 16 September 1975. The efforts at the UN level were driven by the proposal adopted by the September 1973 Summit Conference of Non-Aligned Nations held in Algiers. The General Assembly Resolution 3202 of 1st May 1974 placed the crisis of the less developed countries firmly on the structural impairment imposed by the global balance of economic power, from the terms of trade for primary commodities producers to the problem of industrialization, trade relations, regulations, and control over the activities of transnational corporations, development finance, sovereignty over natural resources, among others. In December 1974, the General Assembly adopted the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States. Article 1 of the Charter affirms that, and I quote, every state has the sovereign and inalienable right to choose its economic system as well as its political, socio-cultural system in accordance with the will of its people without outside interference, coercion, or threat in any form whatsoever, end of quote. The sovereignty affirmed in Article 1 was fleshed out in the remaining parts of the Charter. A country's sovereignty over its natural resources, regulations of foreign investment within its national borders, including not being compelled to grant preferential treatment to foreign investment, to regulate activities of transnational corporations, nationalize, expropriate, or transfer ownership of foreign property with adequate compensation. Article 5 affirms the right of countries to form organizations of primary commodity producers in order to develop their national economies to achieve stable financing for their development. At the heart of the Charter is the right of countries to their own development, redress in international balance of power, equitable international trade regime, resources for financing development, sourcing and development of technologies for national development, and the elimination of the vestiges of colonialism and neocolonialism. The demand for a new international economic order, emboldened by the success of OPEC as an organization of largely southern petroleum producers and driven by the non-aligned movement, animated extensive intellectual production and concerted response from the global north, and especially scholars in the US around the Council for Foreign Relations, were very influential in this area. There were negotiations within the UN system by the dominant countries of the global north to temper the militant tone of these early resolutions. As Looney argued, notes, the US proposal to quote, centered on the basic principles of maintaining the existing economic system and the provision of development assistance through increased trade liberalization, the transfer of aid and technologies through international organizations outside the direct control of the United Nations, and the creation of some programs for the stabilization of commodity prices and creation of some buffer stock, of a fund to stabilize export earnings of developing countries, and of agreements on coffee, cocoa, and sugar, end of quote. Even the consensus that saw through the passing of the resolution 3362 in September 1975 wore thin. At the UNCTAD 4 conference in Nairobi 8 months later, the US and Germany voted against the proposal to establish the new international economic order. The pushback and the complete subversion of the NIEO will come in the 1980s. But in the meantime, efforts to give effect to the African countries' right to development were taking shape. At the 16th ordinary session of the OAU Heads of State meeting in July 1979, the Monrovia Declaration adopted the Declaration on Commitments, and I quote, on the guidelines and measures for national and collective self-reliance in economic and social development for the establishment of a new international economic order, end of quote. The effect of this was the OAU Lagos Plan of Action and Final Act, which adopted an integrated regional approach to the task of achieving economic and social development. The international economic order against which countries of the South railed in their demand for a new order was reasserted with a vengeance in the 1980s.
Within the global north, it was the orthodox neoliberal rejection of the Keynesian consensus. In the south, it was in the remaking of the world within the neoliberal image in what John Toye referred to as the counter-revolution in development theory and policy. The age of structural adjustment was launched in Africa by the World Bank's publication of the Berg Report in an apparent counterposition to Lagos Plan of Action. What followed is common course. For our purpose, its relevance is in its uncompromising negation of the right to development. From the World Bank to the UN agencies themselves, and the rise of the World Trade Organizations, what emerged was a systematic stripping of states of the autonomy and policy sovereignty demanded in the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States. I shift attention now to the UN General Assembly of 1986 Declaration and its aftermath. The 1986 Declaration of the UN General Assembly on the Right to Development represents a crossover between the affirmation of the rights of nation states to development and the ascription of the right to development on individuals as a right of individuals. As a crossover, it inhabits both tendencies and the right to development discourse. In regard to development as a corporate and international and individual right, the declaration and the subsequent developments within the UN system represent a capitulation to the neoliberal logic and a critique of the neoliberal orthodoxy. Article 1 of the declaration affirms that, and I quote, the right to development is an inalienable human right, by virtue of which every human person, all peoples are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development, in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. End of quote. Article 2 affirms that states have, and I quote, the right and duty to formulate appropriate national development policies that aim at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population and of all individuals on the basis of their active, free, and meaningful participation in development and in the fair distribution of the benefits resulting therefrom. End of quote. Article 9.1 affirms that all aspects of right to development set forth in the declaration are indivisible and interdependent, and each of them should be considered in the context of the whole. Article 4.2 argues that sustained action is required to promote more rapid development of developing countries, ostensibly to affirm the interdependence of individuals' rights to civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights set out in the declaration. The declaration makes a case for how funds released by disarmament and reduced defense spending can be used to finance development. 5 years earlier, on 27th June 1981, the OAU heads of states and government had adopted the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. The Charter entered into force less than 2 months before the UN General Assembly declaration. A link is often made between the Charter and the declaration, especially in regard to Article 22 of the Charter, which affirmed that, I quote, all peoples shall have the rights to their economic, social, and cultural development with due regard to their freedom and identity and the equal enjoyment of the common heritage of humankind. End of quote. Beyond traditional human rights discourse, an important aspect of the Charter is the affirmation of collective people's rights. In its affirmation of rights to economic, social, and cultural development to all peoples, often interpreted as the aggregate of individuals, but you could argue differently that in fact it's a composite collective right of people as an aggregate rather than just an aggregation of individuals. In this, the Charter does not break new grounds other than the specific use of development which emerges in the UN General Assembly Declaration Statement. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes the case for most of these rights, as do subsequent UN conventions and covenants. Similarly, T.H. Marshall's essay on citizenship has affirmed the same in this discussion of social rights, something often erroneously referred to as social citizenship in social policy literature. However, what is less acknowledged in the discussion of the African Charter is that it was the same 16th ordinary session of the African Heads of State and Governments of Monrovia in 1979 that approved the work of the Lagos Plan of Action, which also approved the preliminary draft of the Charter. In other words, the affirmation of the nation-state's right to development in the context of the demand for a new international economic order was connected to the Charter of Human and People's Rights. Put differently, in the context of the African Continents Organization, the Lagos Plan of Action and the African Charter are two sides of the same coin, generating development and an affirmation of people's right to participate in the process of development and benefit equitably from its proceeds. It was in the aftermath of the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights that the composite duality of the sovereign right to development and the rights as individual rights drifted apart. In paragraphs 10, 11, 72, and 73 of the Vienna Declaration, the program of action which referred to the right to development out of 100 paragraphs, the conference reiterated the 1986 Declaration affirmation of the right to development as an inalienable and, quote, an integral part of fundamental human rights. Where the 1986 Declaration gestured in the direction of the sovereign right of development, the Vienna Declaration did nothing of the kind. Yet it would seem that many of the member states at the UN understood the Declaration on the right to development to apply to sovereign rights, as well as individual rights to participate in the development process and share equitably in the proceeds of development. For instance, in his 2003 report to the 58th session of the General Assembly, the UN Secretary General reported that Japan, quote, disagreed with the legal obligation of developed countries to render assistance to developing countries. That was a formal objection entered by Japan. The US will do the same thing, Cuba, on the other hand, warned that, and I quote, some developed countries were trying to redefine the right to development as a personal right and utopian aspiration for the future in an attempt to evade their responsibilities to solidarity and international cooperation, and ultimately to continue delaying indefinitely the full realization of that right, end of quote. The Republic of Cuba went further to argue that the neoliberal globalization depriving most underdeveloped countries not only of their autonomy, which they need to take the decision on development policy appropriate to their circumstances, but also of the means, options, policy alternatives, and instruments that have been available to the developed countries themselves at a similar state of their development. Now, we'll remember that this was something that Andrew Chang, a year earlier, was the subject of his kicking away the ladder book. Article 3.3 of the 1986 Declaration affirmed that, quote, states have the duty to cooperate with each other in ensuring development and eliminating obstacles to development. The obligation on states requires it to be in such a manner as to promote a new international economic order. Clearly, there are UN member states who understood the right to development not simply as individual rights, but also identified the persistent hurdles to the sovereign realization of the right to development of nation states. Ayush Sengupta, as the independent expert, was appointed to flesh out the contents and the modalities for the implementation of the right to development as articulated in declaration and subsequent UN proclamations. A few things arise from his enunciation of the rights. First, the individual's right to development has a double inflection. As a process right and as a right to the outcomes of development. As a process right, it is, to quote him, the right to a process that expands the capabilities of freedoms of individuals to improve their well-being and to realize what they value. End of quote. As a right to outcome, it is concerned with equitable access to the proceeds of development in a manner that increases human capability. A right to the outcome of development is, quote, is quite different from the right to the process that produces that outcomes, end of quote. Clearly then, both can be made distinct from development itself. In terms of socioeconomic development, the former will be encapsulated in the idea of human rights-based approach to development, While it may be true, as Sen argues, that, and I quote him, the development is not the acquisition of more goods and services, but the enhanced freedom to choose to lead the kind of life one values, end of quote. Still, to defeat poverty as capability failure, society will need to produce, at some stage, more to reduce material deprivation and expand not only capabilities, but actual functioning. Part of the basis of an equity-informed and social justice-driven social and economic development is precisely to expand human functioning. In an extreme hypothetical situation, it would be difficult to imagine the freedom to choose in condition of extreme individual and societal deprivation. It must be recognized, Sengupta reminds us, that all rights, including civil, political rights, involve using resources to expand the supply of the corresponding goods and services and possibly public expenditure, end of quote. The idea that we can talk about the right to development of individuals without paying attention to the imperative, especially in the African context, to the sustained and coherent development project would be perverse in the extreme. Yet, this is the dominant position taken by even some African scholars and activists who lash onto the notion of right to development as a human right. It is a position with closer affinity to the 1993 Vienna Declaration than the 1986 Declaration of the Rights to Development, or even the OAU position on the matter. Second, the right to development is a composite right to a process of development. The integrity of these rights implies that if any one of them is violated, the whole composite right to development is also violated. And I quote here, was Sengupta, If all the rights involved, civil, political, social, economic, and cultural, are inalienable and indissoluble, they cannot be negotiated away or separated. They all have to be fulfilled or all fail if anyone is not realized. Sengupta, refers to vector of human rights. A question that arises is this: if in a country of 10 million people with a vector of rights involving hypothetically 22 distinguishable rights, and all 22 rights are delivered to all but one of the 10 million citizens, will the right to development have been violated? At the abstract level, the indissolubility of the vector of rights might work. It becomes very problematic at the level of policy and implementation. In spite of the attempts to argue that civil and political rights are not different from social, economic, and cultural rights, the progressive realization tag, which is often attached to the constitutional provision for social and economic rights, is in a way that is not tagged to civil and political rights. Often, the latter are deemed of immediate application and justiciable. More importantly, the obligation of the states to facilitate an international environment conducive to countries overcoming their state of underdevelopment lies even more at the level of appeal rather than something enforceable. Amartya Sen drew on Kant's distinction, and this is an old text, between perfect obligation and imperfect obligations. Only some of the composite rights within the right to development involve perfect obligations, rights with clearly specific bearers of obligations to protect or fulfill the rights, which may carry the force of legislation or is institutionalized. Claims, he argued, addressed generally to anyone who can help, may have the effect of motivating action and norms setting, but will fall within the remit of imperfect obligation. I will argue that often such rights without perfectly specified obligation bearers carry the force of charity. This is particularly so when the appeal is made to the international community. The qualifiers that often accompany the fulfillment of socioeconomic and cultural rights, especially the idea of progressive realization, bring them closer to the sphere of imperfect rather than perfect obligation. Simply clothing such claims making in the garb of human rights to the neglect of the political economy of how we secure access to participation, capability strengthening, and prevent discrimination will not do. This is even more significant within the prevailing neoliberal context. While an assertion made by people against whom Sen was contending, it is important to note that, as he put it, in the absence of perfect obligations, demands for human rights are often seen just as loose talk. End of quote. This is without discounting Sen's contention that, and quote, the importance of human rights need not lie only in their being putative proposals for legislation on institutionalization, end of quote. This is even more so in the neoliberal context in which much of the debate takes place. In this sense, Marx claimed that in the post-Cold War period, there is no longer an ideological rationale for favoring one category of rights over another, end of quote, falls in the realm of fantasy. The neoliberal insurgency since the late 1970s is precisely the ideological framework that has driven efforts to roll back socioeconomic rights, public provisioning, and socialization of services. States' retrenchment, at least the retrenchment of its responsibility for social provisioning, have been ideologically driven by the insistence that the market is the primary domain of social provisioning, at least the first port of call. The problem, of course, is that the market inheres no social purpose, including giving force to socioeconomic rights. In the stabilization phase of structural adjustment, the first part of the budget to be cut are those concerned with social investment and social spending. In failing to confront the neoliberal orthodoxy head-on, those who insist on a human rights-driven right to development fall into the trap of what the Yoruba will refer to as focusing on the treatment of guinea worm while ignoring leprosy. In highlighting the new consensus around the right to development, Sengupta flagged the fact that the United States, which cast the lone dissenting vote against the 1986 declaration in the General Assembly, signed up to the 1993 Vienna Declaration. The unexplored question is why? Why the General Assembly Declaration joined the demand for a new international economic order with individual and group rights to development, the Vienna Declaration ignored the national sovereign dimension of the right to development. In the Vienna Declaration, the right to development became largely a question of individual rights to meaningful participation in development and to benefit from the proceeds. Rather than a subject of celebration, the consensus achieved in the 1993 Vienna Declaration involved the diminution of a holistic take on the right to development, where the claims made on the developed countries within the framework of new international economic order was a matter of rights and moral obligation. The Vienna Declaration made, and I quote, the support for international community to the least developed countries conditional, made it conditional on the latter countries' commitment to, quote, to the process of democratization and economic reforms. The NIEO language was conspicuous by its absence in the Vienna Declaration. The economic reforms that the Vienna Declaration refers to are the structural adjustment programs that were being rammed down the throats of countries through the Bretton Woods institutions. The economic reform created the lost decades in Africa and the associated widespread entitlement failure. Mkandawire referred to it as the maladjustment of African economies. The economic reform displays the obligation of the states in the 1986 declaration to undertake development planning and precipitated the economic and social dislocations that severely undermine the rights of development as a process and beneficial rights of people. This is a discussion we'll come to shortly in a minute. A related issue concerns the indivisibility approach to the right to development often taken in the human rights discourse. This becomes problematic without an appreciation that the right to development as set out in the 1986 General Assembly Declaration involves two sets of interrelated but distinct rights: the national sovereign rights to development and the right of individuals. Surely, national sovereign rights may be fundamental rights, but they do not avail themselves of the human rights discourse. Sovereign states are not individuals. While they may have fundamental rights to self-determination, the right against foreign domination and occupation and aggression and threats against their national sovereignty, as set out in the preamble of the 1986 Declaration, these are not human rights, but fundamental rights of states and collectives of people. Human rights, as we know it, is a product of the natural law approach of the European Enlightenment. It asserts the constitution of the polity on the basis of the contractual relationship between the sovereign and the individual citizens. Rather than an axiomatically given set of rights that accrue to people by the fact of their being human rights, being human, rights as we understand them are products of human struggle. As Greer notes, and I quote, its emergence as a set of legal and moral norms betrays the fact that the white European male property owner is the paradigm case of the human. Others historically have had to fight even to be seen as fully capable of bearing rights, end of quote. The claim to Greek, American, and French origins will miss the fact that the human in the human rights did not apply to a substantial portion of the human population in these territories. Held as chattel slaves or as women who were considered minors. This is important given the increasing tendency to displace the rights discourse from the domain of political and social struggles to the juridical plane. I shift now to a penultimate, section of the presentation, to a brief look at Africa's lost decades as inherently a subversion of collective as well as individual rights to development. While it is true that individual rights to participate in the process of development and to benefit equitably from the process of development cannot be demurred on the grounds of their country's low level of development, the interdependence of the two dimensions of the rights to development is nonetheless primary. It is difficult to assert the process rights if self-consciously the feasibility of development planning and processes is vitiated. The capacity of individuals to claim the right to equitable benefit from the proceeds of development is difficult where primacy is given to market forces in the allocation of socioeconomic rights, socioeconomic benefits. Yet these have been the experiences in Africa at precisely the time of the crescendo of human rights approach to the right to development. Again, the 1979 OAU Heads of State Summit that was seized with both the works of the Lagos Plan of Action and the African Charter of Human and People's Rights was animated by Africa's persistent colonial political economy, relatively weak economic growth rates, and socioeconomic benefits to its people. It was a task made more urgent by the oil shocks of the 1970s and their socioeconomic impact. The Lagos Plan of Action for Economic Development of Africa was a collective response intended to drive economic development precisely on collective self-reliance, premised on collective self-reliance. The second oil shock, repeated drought in the Sahel, and the collapse in commodity prices on which many of the African countries depended, partly a consequence of the deflationary effects of the policies that the Reagan government in the US pursued, deepened the balance of payment and budget crisis across the region. The responses from the international IMF and the World Bank, as I argued earlier on, was framed by the Berg Report. It launched the neoliberal, counter-revolution, as Toye will argue. While the Berg Report promised Africa's accelerated development, its policy prescription delivered the exact opposite, Africa's lost decades. In this sense, the continent remains an active crime scene. As a measure of the structural change in an economy, if the average share of manufacturing in gross domestic products of sub-Saharan African countries experienced an increase from a little over 6% in 1960 to about 13% in 1982, the period after that witnessed a decline, And I've limited myself to this range, the data range, because it allows us to get a sense of the pre-1980, performance of the aggregate performance of African economies, sub-Saharan African economies, as well as the look into the first 3 decades of structural adjustments. Interestingly, the World Bank does not publish this document, what do you call it? The databases of the something. The World Development Indicators does not start from 1960, so you don't get to see what came before and so on and so forth. It sounds like conspiracy theory, but when data becomes hostage to the politics of economic reform, then as a measure of domestically generated resources needed for investment in development efforts, the share of gross domestic savings in the GDP, as imperfect a measurement as it is an important measure. And that's the small slide, graph at the bottom there. Similar to the story of the share of manufacturing in the country's GDP, gross domestic savings increased from slightly over 20% in 1960 to over 25% in 1980, and a decline in the post-1980 period. If figures 1 and 2 deal with the capacity of at the national levels, figures 3 and 4 focus on the impact of the stabilization and liberalization regimes at the individual levels, and therefore the rights of individuals to benefit from the proceeds of development. While per capita GDP is a crude measure, it's a crude measure of the effects of the growth, what is evident in figures 3, what is evident in figure 3 is that between 1960 and 1982, Sub-Saharan Africa experienced a sustained increase in per capita GDP, a decline between then and 1995, and an increase thereafter. The paradox of this N-shaped movement is in per capita GDP is evident in figure 4, and the effects of the neoliberal economic reforms. As figure 4 shows, using the poverty datum line of $2.50 per person per day, the number of people, again, I know that that's a crude measure, but not to generate a new data that the orthodox people will argue against, would decide to use their data, as figure 4 shows, using the poverty datum line of $2.50 per person per day, the number of people living in poverty in sub-Saharan Africa more than doubled between 1981 and 2011, the first 3 decades of the neoliberal project. The paradox referred to earlier on is evident in the rising level of poverty at the same time that per capita GDP was recovering. A case of the declining poverty elasticity or growth. Taking the 2 dimensions of the right to development together, the experience of the sub-Saharan African countries has been the simultaneous violation of the national sovereign right to development and that of the individual rights to development. The international environment that prevails in the post-1990s is more arduous in its in the restrictions it imposes on national rights to self-determination and the state's rights and obligations to produce effective development policies than those outlined in the Charter of Algiers. The fulfillment of the national sovereign rights and the national capacity to advance socioeconomic and political development is important as the basis for ensuring equitable participation in and sharing in the benefits of development. A discussion of the right to development in the 21st century would be a delusion if it fails to confront the prevailing international economic order. I end with a brief statement on the question of national sovereign projects and policy sovereignty. To reiterate, again, the dual use of the duality of the rights to development. Against the background of the discussions in the preceding section, we emphasize two elements of the prerequisite for achieving the right to development: the reconstitution of the sovereign national project and the policy sovereignty. The right and duty that the 1986 Declaration places upon states to formulate appropriate national development policies requires the capacity of the country in question to articulate a sovereign development project, which takes into consideration the specificities of the countries, its location within the international economic and political system, and its endowment, human and material. The essence of such national development policies will involve active engagement of the citizens in shaping the development path and equitable access to the benefits of the development process. A sovereign national project in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious context must make nation building a critical element in its development path and requires a leadership core that is trans-ethnic and trans-religion in orientation and disposition. Constructing sovereign projects in the 21st century requires recapturing the spirit of the Lagos Plan of Action, which appreciates the value of collective self-reliance among African countries in overcoming the limitations of geography, national fragmentation, and relatively small population at individual country levels. A collective strategy of structural transformation of African economies is necessary for securing self-sustaining social and economic development that is ecologically sustainable. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. That really, I'm sure you'll all agree, was a magnificent historical presentation of these dual threads and their interweaving, the tensions between them, and the politics driving those shifts, the philosophical underpinnings, and the implications for development. I found that really, really extraordinarily interesting, and I'm sure it's generated some questions. So we have some time, and there are mics roving around, I think. So please raise a hand and perhaps introduce yourself briefly when you ask a question. So I have one behind you there. Maybe would you like to take a cluster of 2 or 3?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so we'll do that. So one up there first, please.
Hello, I'm Professor Jimi. My name is Olusegun from University of York, politics and environment researcher. You concluded with the right of the duality of the right to development. The first one is clear, which is the reconstitution of the sovereign national project. I wasn't clear about the second one in your summation.
Sorry.
You mentioned the duality of the right to development in your summation. So the first one is clear. You mentioned the reconstitution of the sovereign national project, which is one of the solutions you preferred. The second one, I didn't quite clearly catch it. Can you summarize that, please?
Okay, and then one over here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jimmy. My name is Iyo Balcha. I'm from University of Bristol. This is such a brilliant summary of what has happened, especially at least in the pre-1990s. But I want you to go a little bit further and much more closer to also what's happening, probably what has been happening in the 90s, post-1990s. And I want to hear your reflection on, for example, the UNECA produced a very powerful document called the African Alternative Framework for the Structural Adjustment Program, which turned everything on its head, especially the structural adjustment the mono-economic approach that was being imposed. But somehow, even though it was adopted by the OAU Ministers of Economies to be a continental document, it was immediately killed off by another document produced by the World Bank, I think 1989, called Sub-Saharan Africa from Crisis to Sustainable Growth, a long-term perspective study, which also had its own policy prescriptions as a precondition. So, one, where do you see the contestation, even though there are decisions that are still adopted at the OAU or the African Union level, but still unable to implement it because of all the conditionalities? Second, we have also African elites that also appropriate the mainstream neoliberal orientation and use again the continental decision-making process as a mechanism of pursuing that. And a good example of this regard is NEPAD, which is just a neoliberal version echoed by African elites. Again, the continental decision-making processes and policy-making processes can be also co-opted in this context. So where do we see this? How can we understand this contestation where those processes are sometimes imposed from outside? At the same time, there are also elites that are doing the job. Like we're witnessing what Ruto is doing in Kenya, what Abiy is doing in Ethiopia at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayob. And then one more for now, Alessandra down here. We'll get some more later.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was, I agree with Chris, magnificent, and the timeline really impressive. I want to push you a little bit towards the last decade and a half, because you have seen slight pickup. Of course, we're not talking about anything even remotely similar to pre-1980s, but there is a small pickup in terms of GDP, manufacturing rate to GDP. And that, I think, in practice, relates to the mushrooming or more labor-intensive types of productions, textile from Ethiopia to flower cutting in parts of Uganda, that type of very labor-intensive industrialization. And I wonder what would be your assessment of that, especially as part of that is actually BRICS investment-led, so China-led, and other BRICS involved too. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. The question from our colleagues from York. When I was talking about duality in terms of the rights, it's sovereign right to development and rights that accrues to states. And then the shift of that into the idea of rights to individuals. The issue of, sovereign national project is about the constitution of a visionary, agenda about the trajectory that you want to take a country to, and that requires, and a corollary of that, policy sovereignty. So the corollary of what do you call it, constructing a sovereign national project is policy sovereignty. You can't have a, what do you call it, I mean, like, where the thing used to happen, where some team or group will come in from Washington, and basically walk through your ministry and tell you this is what you do, this is what you don't do, and so on and so forth. That, of course, has, morphed in different ways, there's a whole brigade also around what is now increased. There was a whole brigade around the social protection, project and so on and so forth. Of that. But I hope that clarifies the thing for you. Okay. Well, I mean, I think the African alternative, which was Adedeji's, as a site of autonomous thinking. The UNECA as a site for autonomous thinking rankles, what do you call it? The guys in Washington, not just in Washington, London, so, and put the cross wire on the back. They were not going to make the mistake of ensuring that whoever takes over the ECA is not one of their own. And subsequent to that, you saw that. But as at that time, and this is where the relative issue of policy sovereignty, and we'll see in some context your work on, Meles Zenawi's Ethiopia. It's something that I'll come to in a minute, but by the time the African alternatives emerged, these countries were already under, detailed policing, how much you could give to your universities, how much you could give to your hospitals, how do you collect revenues in hospitals, and so on and so on. Very, very detailed micromanagement of, on the basis that if you do this, then you have, financial resources, so that the will, the capacity to actually do, what do you call it, anything remarkable with the document was not there. Okay. And I think part of, you put your finger on it, when the banks used to talk about the winners and losers, if you didn't take into consideration what was going on, you also failed to recognize some of the class dimension, in what was good. There's a whole army of people that were trained in economics, neoclassical economics, in many cases, and you will remember this, I think most of us will remember this, officials coming out of IMF and the World Bank to come and run countries, from Alassane Ouattara, to the guy in Benin Republic and so on and so forth, and the way in which the orthodoxy itself found resonance. The first phase of it faced resistance. Don't crucify me for this, but AERC was set up especially to try and muscle, the African, economists, into reshaping the new generation into producing this nation. The NEPAD is not just the only one. It's a manifestation of a crisis. The way I described this thing was that it even fails to recognize the history of the continent it was talking about. And that really is the real challenge, contemporary. There are flickers of hope and light there and there. The Meles experiment in Ethiopia was snuffed out. You have some of the things going on in the Kagame's Rwanda, and so on and so forth. And if you listen to the old man in Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, it's difficult to, the idea that, it's still aspiration about development. Now,
there's been a loosening up of the international environment. The point now is about recalibrating the thinking in a more developmentally aspirational terms, in coherent, development policy making, and so on and so forth. So there is place for hope there, but at the same time, there are very scary cases. I mean, we went through COVID and came out of COVID with all sort of, debt crisis and destabilization and so on and so forth, which in many countries from Ghana to Zambia, simply through countries back and so on and so forth. And this time, rather than the multilateral, bilateral loan system, something, it's capital market. And the idea that you simply could not carol them into what do you call it, into line in some of head shaving and so on and so forth, or debt cancellation and so on, and so on. So it's space for hope. It's space for a very cautious hope. But that brings me back to the point about the imperative of sovereign national projects, a clear understanding of sovereign national projects and so on and so forth, in which the clear visionary agenda setting, and policy sovereignty, becomes crucial in finding our way out of this mess. But that comes with an acknowledgement of the sovereign rights of countries to development. I don't know if
can we, just before we come to you, do we have any online questions, Mike? How many have you got?
Just one.
Okay.
Which is, thanks for that. So I'm going to be asking questions from our question from our online audience. So this is from B from IIT Hyderabad. Two questions. Firstly, given you highlight the increasingly depoliticized nature of the human rights discourse, how would you respond to the application of this discourse to the question of development, which is a deeply political question? And secondly, could you please highlight the intra-Africa differences in development trajectory, differences in populations, women, and so on?
So we've got that, and then if we can...
Sorry, I didn't get the first one.
Okay. Given you highlight the increasingly depoliticized nature of the human rights discourse, how would you respond to the application of this discourse to the question of development, which is a deeply political question? Yeah.
Kate? Who are you pointing at, Kate?
Yeah, the mic is here.
Okay.
Thank you very much for a brilliant lecture, Professor Adesina. My name is Ilyas Alami, Cambridge University. We live in an age of turbulent geopolitical and geoeconomic realignments. So do you think that's an opportunity for developing countries to assert their right to development and to affirm various sovereign national projects? And if yes, how and what kind of alliances, or who's the subject of all that? Thank you very much.
And then if you're going to run around there, this gentleman here has one.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for that interesting presentation. I want to pick your mind on the last comment you made on the acknowledgement or the need to acknowledge Africa's right to development. I'm looking at the Global Development Agenda, picking from your conversation, as a continuously destabilizing feature for most African countries from the 80s through to now. Congo, Niger, Cameroon, the Amber region, elsewhere, Burkina Faso, are continuously, or Zimbabwe if we can add, a destabilizing feature. How then do we explain the continued trust, if I can call it, of African leadership to some of these agendas, even those that threaten to destabilize their own economies? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't subscribe to the idea that human rights is a juridical problem. It's something for, you leave for lawyers. What we refer to as human rights were things people fought for, died for. And can easily be lost. At the rhetorical level, you can argue about this, but fundamentally, it's political. It's less than what you call it in some contexts. A century and 2 decades ago, that women could not vote. Or in many contexts in which, as late as the last century, people in many parts of Africa, some parts of Africa could not vote. It took, and you would think that that's an inalienable right, that comes with political rights and so on and so forth. But it had to be struggled for. Same thing with development. It's one thing to argue that you have acknowledged and affirmed the rights, but it's something that has to be deliberately fought for, and so on and so forth. So I don't know whether I answered the first part of the question. Everything is political in my sense of it. Of course, there are significant differences in in composition of African economies and societies. And the picture given here is an aggregate sub-Saharan African level rate of industrialization, the performance on things like women representation, and so on and so forth. There are huge differences and so on and so forth. But the whole idea here was just to provide an aggregate picture of that. From things like, even the level of informality of economies and so on and so forth. There are significant differences, economic performance and so on and so forth. And the question of in the age of diversity of global alliance, there is, let me put it this way: China coming into the picture altered the terrain fundamentally for many African countries. Now, there are two ways in which you can look at it. You can look at China as offering, alternative way to get access to money. Or you can think of it in terms of alternative mechanisms for growing your economy and expanding and deepening your economy and so on and so forth. There are many of us many people on the African continent who argue, this China, that, and so on and so forth. My position is a very simple thing. If you approach anybody for any support, it has to be based on a particular project that you have in which that thing fits in. If you approach the Chinese and say, oh, we'll give you oil and you build a stadium, they'll build you a stadium. if you say want for infrastructure development, they put it in infrastructure development. If Chinese companies come to, put factories in your country, if you don't have regulatory framework and things like that, they will do what they want to do. It's your responsibility as a country to have strong regulatory systems in place to ensure that you can, manage, things that come into your economy and so on and so forth. But it does offer alternatives. I mean, I think, that in a way explains the less of the more flagrant arrogance that I used to experience in the 90s in encounters with World Bank guys and so on and so forth. And you meeting it, something I say, oh, you don't understand, it's because you don't understand it. What do you mean I don't understand it? Somebody was asking me once, why are people rioting in Lusaka? So I said, where you come from, there's electricity 24 hours a day. There's water supply 24 hours a day, and so on and so forth. Imagine somebody who gets electricity, and the little that he gets, you want to take it away. Why are you surprised that people who get on the streets and protest, and so on and so forth? You don't sort of get that, attitude, anymore. So yes, it's a more plural world, it's a more diverse world, and so on and so forth. And lessons to learn in terms of, and as Thandikam Kandawure will argue, it's not about mimicry. For your own development process itself, you need to know yourself, and you know your antecedents, and you know your history, and so on and so forth. But it's a slightly different environment, but it requires a change in mindset at the level of leadership and the way in which we approach international, I mean, you when people started taking this capital market loans and so on and so forth, it looks like, oh, it's money free that's coming in and so on and so forth. Keep in mind, although, that in countries like Zambia, the primary source of national income and this and that, the mining industry and this had basically been sold off on fire sale and so on and so forth. They continue to generate revenue, and every time you argue about increasing the rent that accrues to the state from thing, you get all sort of protests and this, and the World Bank released a report earlier in the year where it was, where essentially cautioning against, anything that will undermine free flow of investment, something and so on and so forth, and you get in a situation now where companies can, on the basis that a new legislation that you're putting in place is likely to affect their profitability, take you to an international arbitration, which is held behind closed door in London here, most of the time. And then I mean, I think Nigeria was facing penalty of almost 15 or 5 billion, US dollars and so on and so forth, until the thing to unravel. So again, we'll come back to the point about the imperative of clearly defined sovereign national projects and policy autonomy. And it requires commitment. It requires focus. It requires, you don't run the country on autopilot. There has to be, clear commitment to a trajectory and a pursuit of that. Yeah, the destabilization thing, I remember Meles once saying that when they came into power, first thing they did, they were sent out some of their officials to several African countries for them to say, what do you experience with, what do you call it, World Bank, IMF, and so on and so forth. And he said what they learned from that is do what you want to do, but don't go around standing on the top rooftop and saying this is, if it's against, you know, what, you know, what do you call it? Against what the IMF, you know, so you can, you know, formally, you know, yeah, we're not disagreeing with you, but, you know, and work clearly within, and AOB has done, you know, incredible work on it. Actually, the Gandawure Prize, you know, the article just came out, you know, 2 weeks ago. Okay, I've done some work in this area, you know. If you take the example of some of the, what do you call it, countries, take Zimbabwe as an example. I don't buy it that everything is about sanction. If you have a disciplined national bourgeois class rather than a rapacious one, there are a lot of things that you can do, you know. I mean, again, forgive me about this. This is not about my alignment or what do you call it, inclination in a particular direction. Yes, sanction was imposed on Russia. And the whole idea was that the economy will unravel in a matter of months. It hasn't, because they took things seriously on their own side and so on and so forth. You know, the same thing, you know, if you're going to take on the world, then know what it will cost you. And the discipline, you know, you can't take the diamond thing, for instance. The idea initially was to say you don't do, what do you call it, you don't sell your diamond at the international market, something in such a way that allows them to seize the proceeds of something. And then it became, you know, private sector. But was the money returned to the central bank, Reserve Bank? No, it wasn't. So it's one thing to argue about, you know, what do you call it, the hostility and this and that you will expect that. But it's about seriousness with which one takes on the responsibility of having to lead a country. I mean, you know, my own country, for instance, it's an absolute mess. You know, I'm not Ghanaian, I'm Nigerian, you know. This is a Ghanaian shirt, you know, but, you know, it's an absolute mess. And it's a mess functioning on corruption on steroid. Okay? Where I mean, people are buying themselves SUVs of 140 million. And when the senator was asked about this, he said, you know, but, you know, for me to drive to my constituency, the road is very bad. But the road is very bad because you didn't repair the road. I-22 situation and so on and so forth, you know, and then you come around, you know, and say, you know, they are not likely to be under sanction because they are not threatening any international something and so on and so forth. And who cares what they do to the local, you know, darkies, you know, there's something on this. But it's not enough, you know. I mean, there's a lot more to the Zimbabwe story that just, you know, and it can be considered permissible just because you expropriated land and redistributed, you know, some of it, you know.
I think Jimmy has only just started getting going, and so is this conversation, which could go on forever, but I think we're going to have to draw it to a close. So please join me in thanking Professor Adesina. We're really great. Thank you so much. Thank you.